Well, hello. This lecture video is intended to support assignment number 36, Jackson and Expanding Presidential Power. You need to watch this video in order to complete assignment number 36. And the whole sort of focus of this assignment is going to be going over expanding presidential power. We're going to talk specifically about Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson. He'll become our seventh president of the United States. Um, and he's kind of a unique character that we want to just focus on specifically because he was so different for his time. And he starts a trend, I guess. Not a trend, I guess. I guess a trend would be a strong word. But he sort of stands out as an individual with a strong character, like has a very character kind of personality, and goes against the grain, I guess you could say, goes against sort of the accepted behavior of what presidents were doing at this time. So, so let's get into it. Again, it's really about Andrew Jackson. We're looking at 1828 time frame here. So a few years after the Monroe Doctrine that we've talked about. Of course, the Monroe Doctrine happens around 1823. And then about 5 years later, we have Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson really is quite unique. And here's my caricature of Andrew Jackson. I will also mention to you that there is a supporting video that is also available in this week's materials too for you to watch. It gives you a much broader background about Andrew Jackson and his life. I will mention a few things briefly here that are important, and then I'll tell you kind of what assignment number 36 looks like and what you should be filling in. So, bottom line is Andrew Jackson becomes a hero in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. He's actually a pretty prominent landowner in the state of Tennessee. And he never had any children of his own, but he was an adoptive father of a Native American who was left on the battlefield, a child that was left on the battlefield of the Battle of New Orleans. And he adopts this Native American child and makes him basically his own son. And he's going to use this later on in his political career as evidence of why he's sympathetic to Native Americans, even though his actions, as we'll find out, contradict this attitude. So just because he adopts a Native American boy and calls him his son doesn't necessarily mean he's a friend of the Native Americans. Okay. So this is a really kind of a critical point. If you're looking at assignment number 36, you're going to see a couple things here. Questions 1 through 4 are really associated with this slide, talking about some of the prominent things that Andrew Jackson did, and then I'll mention to you as well what were some of the effects or the reactions that people had based upon these 4 things that he did. Also, in another couple slides here, we'll talk about question number 5, which was a Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia, which was a decision by the Supreme Court about Native Americans, and then we'll talk about how Jackson reacted to that decision and what he did. And then on questions 6 and 7, they're more broad. Question 6 is asking you to think about a little bit about what you know about Andrew Jackson through this discussion and how he might be compared with the actions that President Donald Trump took in his 4 years of the presidency. Oftentimes, especially recently, people have compared in many ways the attitudes that Jackson has or had, because he's not here anymore, with the attitudes that Donald Trump had while he was president and even post-president. And then the last question on assignment 36 asks you about, what do you think? Is Jackson a hero or is Jackson a villain, right? A villain is like a bad person. A hero is somebody who, we look up to. So is he a Superman hero, or is he sort of like, I don't know, the Joker? Is he sort of like a really bad version of the anti-hero Batman? I guess you might want to think of it like that. And then, to give me your sort of explanation about what do you think. All right. So let's get into this. Um, Again, I just want to focus on four key things here that Andrew Jackson is highly noted for and things that he did. Jackson comes to power um, really with this idea that he is a supporter of the common people. Okay, and why this is important is because Jackson was from the South, and even though he was a wealthy landowner, he had a lot of differences between a lot of different ways of looking at how government should function compared to people in the North. He believed that most members of government, especially at the federal level, were pretty corrupt and they just were in it for their own interests. So when he runs for the presidency, he runs on this platform that we call it, right? This political platform, this set of values that he is out to support the common people and protect their interests. Number one, all right? So, one of the things that he does to start with, and this is one of those points here, one of those 4 points, one of those things that Jackson did was he closed down the national bank. He closed the federal bank. He just shut it down. This is the bank that was in charge of essentially funding and holding on to the money that the government was collecting from a taxation standpoint. This is the same bank that when we think about Hamilton, right, when he wants to establish a national bank, this is the same bank that we're talking about. And the reason why Jackson wanted to close it down is because he believed that it favored the wealthy people only. And there was a lot of wealthy people, he said, that were making profit off of this and at the expense of the common people. And he said it was unconstitutional. Again, he goes back to this idea that was originally claimed by Jefferson, really, that there was nothing in the Constitution that really gave the government the right to even create this to start with. So, what's the results of this? Well, the common people look at this and they go, hey, here's a president who's willing to take action. He's firm. Um, they do away with paper money, basically, and they start trading in gold and silver in this country for a while. So, paper money basically is not printed. It kind of goes and stops being printed, and he goes back to what's called the gold standard, where gold and silver were used as a form of trade. Now, that can be kind of complicated, right? Because what happens when you don't have enough gold and silver? Well, people started to barter and use the barter system or trading for other things. Wealthy New Englanders despised Jackson for this because it obviously hurt the ability to get loans from the government, and it just made things more complicated. In fact, Jackson, in the story of this whole bank thing, goes directly up against the federal uh, bank chairman and challenges him. And even though Congress said, hey, we don't think this is a good idea that you should close the bank, Jackson says, I don't really care what you guys think. I'm going to do it anyway. And he does. And Congress, because they were sort of becoming really afraid of Jackson and his power, they didn't stop him from doing it. And so the bank would close down during Jackson's presidency. And then after he's not president anymore, we'll see that it starts back up again. Okay. So that's one of the points. Another sort of what did Jackson do action here is he expanded voting rights across the nation. He opened up voting rights to counties or remote rural areas that didn't always have easy access to the ability to vote on the national and state level. Now, obviously, who does this really favor? Well, it favors Jackson because he wants the support of the common people. He's what we call in political science, we call him a populist president. Populist, populist president. Popular among the common people. Um, and so obviously he wants their vote because he wants their, you know, their support, right? And he's sort of like trying to connect with them. Again, when we look at the results of this, a lot of people love this. A lot of people love Jackson for this because he makes the ability to get to a voting station much easier. Now, at this time in the 1820s, late 1820s, there was still some fishy stuff that would go on with elections. It wasn't always on the up and up when we think about, fake elections and things like that. There was some problems with elections. There was a lot of bribery involved and double vote counting and all that kind of stuff. So, this would definitely be something that would favor Jackson and people that supported him versus those that were considered his enemies, I guess. Another key point, a really big part of Jackson's presidency is the idea of what we call the spoils system. The spoils system. And Jackson is a master at utilizing what's called the spoils system, where he would give friends who had helped him get elected, he would get them jobs in the government. Like he would appoint them to really important positions of power within the government. And in often cases, he would do so and put people in positions of responsibility and leadership that really were not qualified to do the job. They didn't have any experience in the job. This idea of what we call spoils system, the spoils system, sort of becomes like a favor system. All right. And Jackson really, really promotes this. Like he basically says to people that support him, if you help me out, I'm going to help you out. Right. If you scratch my back, I'm going to scratch your back and I'll take care of you. So what this creates, really, the result of this is two things. Either you love Jackson because he's helping you out, or you can't stand him because he's alienating you from opportunity. Another thing that this creates is a group of what we call bureaucrats, right? People who work in the government who are really not successful at running departments of the government. So, because they're not qualified and they don't know what they're doing, the government becomes really, really disorganized. And there's aspects of it, parts of the government, branches, not full branches, but like parts of the executive branch that really become inefficient. And so a lot of New Englanders, especially the wealthy business New Englanders, really despised Jackson, especially if they were not supporters of him, for the spoils system, for handing out these favors. The last point that I want to talk to you about here, one of the big actions that Jackson takes is his support of the removal of Native Americans, or what we call Indians here, to Western lands. Okay. Part of Jackson's popularity, his support, comes from people who want to see Native Americans taken off land so that it can be made available for white people to settle the land, right? Really, really, really rich resource areas, especially in the southern states. What we would look at is like Georgia and Arkansas and Mississippi and Louisiana and even Florida, the Carolinas. He basically says, look, we need to move these people, these Native Americans, off the land because they're in the way. They're in the way of progress. They're not willing to cooperate with America's government. They don't want to learn our ways. They don't want to follow our laws. And of course, a lot of European or origin people, a lot of white people, I mean, I'll just be frank, basically say, yeah, let's get rid of these people. Let's move them out. And this becomes a strategy of Jackson to look at Native Americans as sort of like savages. His experience with Native Americans goes back to even before the War of 1812. We know that he was attacked as a young man by Native Americans. He had a really bad experience also with British soldiers who had Native Americans helping them. He's in the War of 1812. He's at the Battle of New Orleans, and he's facing a group of Native Americans who are supporting the British, and he goes to war with them. So his attitude towards Native Americans is pretty negative. I know there's been some historians that would say that Jackson was basically a racist. He sort of looks at Native Americans as less than anything but a savage. And so that kind of attitude carries over into his promotion of moving Native Americans out of areas that he wanted to see white people have an opportunity to get land from, settle, buy the land, and then grow the country. Um, Sympathetic Northerners obviously did not like this, um, but there were a lot of people that really supported him in this attitude. In fact, he was just sort of echoing in many ways what a lot of white Southerners and even a few people from the North were supporting, were suggesting, which was to move Native Americans onto what's called reservations, land set aside or reserved for them to occupy. So what he does, okay, is through something called the Indian Removal Act, an act that he supports and he signs that's passed by Congress and a lot of his loyal supporters. There's a law that's created that will essentially force Native Americans off their land and moved on to federal land that's called reservations. Okay. One of the most popular places that was set aside during this time was an area that was called the Oklahoma Territory. Okay. The Oklahoma Territory, or Indian Territory is what it's called here on this map. So if you look at this map, there were several different groups, and you can see them outlined here in purple. The Sac and Fox, the Cherokee, the Creek Indians, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, um, the Seminole Indians from Florida. A lot of these people uh, were forced to start on a journey that would take them literally across the eastern half of the United States and force them to live on land that was reserved, Indian reservations was reserved for these people. Okay. So all these people were removed from their native land, land that was familiar with, that they were familiar with, land that they knew how to, get resources from, feed themselves off of, and they're put on land that they have no idea what it looks like. And these become what are known as the Indian removal routes. So the law supports this Indian Removal Act, will support Jefferson using the military to gather these people up and push them, march them across the country to resettle in these places here. Okay. Um, but it doesn't go without a challenge. And this is related to question number 5 on your assignment number 36. There are a group of lawyers that will actually file a lawsuit against Jackson. Um, they were led by an attorney by the name of Worcester. That's where this comes from, who will essentially defend a group of Cherokee Indians who will file a lawsuit against the government, against the state of Georgia in this case, to stop this from happening. Okay. And ultimately what happens is the court will rule in favor of the Cherokee, of the Worcester in this case. They'll rule in favor that the Indians do have a right to stay where they are, and that the government could not interfere with Indian nations. Okay, so this is kind of a really big deal, because what ends up happening is this decision then by Georgia is appealed, and it goes all the way to Washington, D.C., to the Supreme Court. And the justice of the Supreme Court at the time will say that the Native Americans have a valid argument that the Constitution and their rights are being violated, and that they should not be removed from these lands. They should be allowed to stay there. Now, here's the really interesting thing. And this is what happens when you look at what did Andrew Jackson do after the decision was made by the Supreme Court. He basically says to the Supreme Court, I don't care what you say. I'm going to do whatever I want. So Chief Justice John Marshall, who hands down this decision from the court that the Indians have a right to stay where they are, um, Jackson just says, well, John Marshall, quote, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him try to enforce it. Okay. So, in other words, the court has no power to enforce the law. Therefore, they can't do anything, even if they decide that what's happening is wrong. This is huge because what we see is a president who ignores the power of the Supreme Court, ignores the authority of the law passed by the Supreme Court, and still directs the military to carry out these marches across the country. Okay, the most famous of these forced migrations is one that's called the Trail of Tears. You can see it here along this red line. The Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was where we see thousands, in the tens of thousands of Native Americans are forced to leave their homes and go on this 800-mile long journey from Georgia to the new Indian Territory. And it's a tragic tale. Hundreds, if not a few thousand Native Americans die along this march. In fact, it takes place in the winter time. They start, I think, like sometime in the end of fall. So it's the worst time ever to try to like pick up all your belongings and go on this forced march. This this image is a little bit deceiving because it shows a lot of wagons and horses. Most of the Native Americans who went on the Trail of Tears, obviously it was a very sad journey, right? Trail of Tears is what gets its name. Most of them were walking, okay? And the story of the Trail of Tears from the Native American perspective is really bad. In large part because a lot of the Native Americans that did perish and die along the way were left to, their dead corpses basically were buried in really makeshift graves along this trail that they were traveling. So, children would bury parents, parents would bury children from the fatigue, from from them getting diseases along the way and not having proper medical attention. And under the Native culture, there's a whole process for respecting the spirit of a dead relative or a dead loved one. And they didn't get a chance to really do that as a part of their culture. So there's a great cultural vacuum here, great cultural loss that takes place among these Native people. And it will resonate even into modern history. It's one of the stories that we don't forget. It's one of the real big tragedies of the Native removal from their lands by the government. And again, we go back to emphasize this. We have, Andrew Jackson, who's basically saying, I don't care about Worcester versus Georgia and that decision. I'm going to do what I want. Try to stop me. Okay. And Congress never did stop him. Congress never stood up and said, hey, we have a president who's violating the law, because a lot of them were afraid of him, to be honest with you. They were afraid of getting on Jackson's bad side, right? Because he was wielding a lot of power and he had support from the people in many cases. That is the white people. All right. So that's the main things that I want to cover here with you on this assignment number 36. I also recommend, again, to get a little bit more understanding of Jackson as a person, please watch the supporting videos that I post for this week. He's a fascinating character. If you also look, I'm asking you on question number 6 on assignment number 36 to make a comparison using your own understanding of what do you know about our past president, Donald Trump. Why would Donald Trump be compared often with the actions of Andrew Jackson? We know that because Trump has told us this, that he was a big fan. He's a big fan of Jackson as a president. Like he was very, like Trump has, President Trump has said, Jackson. He admired him greatly. In fact, he had a portrait. One of the first portraits he ever put up in the White House in the Oval Office was a portrait of Andrew Jackson. So maybe I think in some ways, if you're looking at how do I know how to compare these two, I think oftentimes historians will look back on this and compare Trump a lot with Jackson and sort of the behavior, the attitude, you know, how they push the envelope, so to speak. Sort of they push out what the president can actually do and what they can get away with, I guess you could say. So take a look at that, think about that question, and then on a number 7, tell me, what do you think? Do you think his actions with the bank, with the spoil system, do you think his actions with, if we go back to this slide, do you think his actions with Indian removal, do you think his actions with opening up elections, do you think that these things would characterize him as a hero of America? Or is he more looked upon as sort of a villain, right? So is he's a common man and he's a war hero, but do some of his actions, could we characterize him as a villain? You tell me, there could be multiple ways to look at this. All right. Thank you for listening to this, and hopefully it wasn't too long. And good luck on assignment 36. I'm looking forward to seeing how you respond to it. Thank you.